Hey everyone, it's Andy here, and in this video I'm going to be finishing the Duel that I started in the previous video. Last time I painted Uta, the darkness, and this time I'm going to paint the light, which is Deorgard. And then we'll finish off with the base and put them together, which should be really fun. I'm looking forward to seeing what these guys look like together. This video is sponsored by us. Yeah, we're sponsoring ourselves. We have an awesome Kickstarter going on right now, which is Deorgard Part 2. And if you like what we do, please consider supporting us over there, picking up a mini, and yeah, we'll make more cool minis. And I promise they won't be elves. So even if you don't like elves, maybe buy one and then we can make some dwarves. That's my big sales pitch. I'm doing my best. So anyway, yeah, check out the Kickstarter. We're super happy how it's going. Just have a look. There's got to be one miniature you like on there. I mean, this one. How can you not like this one? It's a must buy. Personally, I think it's miniature of the year, but I would say that, wouldn't I? Anyway, that's my sales plug. Let's do some painting. In the first video, I wanted to do it without any airbrushing. In this video, I'm going to use the airbrush quite a lot because I've got one. If you don't have an airbrush, then you're definitely going to be able to follow this tutorial anyway. It's just going to take you a tiny bit longer as I'm just, spraying stuff on is very quick. One of the reasons I want to use the airbrush is we're doing a lot of metallics on this one. It was just a trim in the previous video, but this one is going to be, all gold, and I like the look of metallics when you airbrush them on. They're just a little bit matter, a little bit flatter, and there's just something about the finish you get when you airbrush them on. This is why I say you don't need the airbrush, you can just paint the metallics on, it will just take you a tiny bit longer. But since there's so much metallic, I thought, why not? Let's try it out. So I'm going to use some Peridot Alchemy, and I've mixed that with some Rhinox Hide to make it a little bit darker, a little bit redder in the shadows. It's quite a green paint, so when we paint it as a highlight, we should get a lovely contrast to the redder shadows. I've not assembled the miniature at the waist, just two parts to this, and that's just going to make it easier doing the back of the cloak and things like that. And all I'm doing is base coating all of the gold parts with this, and you can see why we're using the airbrush. It just goes on really smooth. I'll probably be able to do this in 2 coats, but it's so quick base coating in this way. Once we got that base coat over everything, nice and dark, nice and consistent, I will do some highlights with the Peridot Alchemy on its own. And this is the only airbrushing we'll do for the gold, so it's just 2 steps, a base coat and a highlight to kick things off, and then we can do some further shadows and some extra highlights with the brush. And that's why I say this is definitely possible with the brush, but you're just gonna really save some time getting some initial color down, which I think is the best way to use the airbrush. Next, we can do the silvers, and there's some nice chainmail and the sword, and I love these metal color series from Vallejo. This is dark aluminium, and we'll just do the same thing. We'll base coat all the silver with this darker one, and then just like the gold, I will do one highlight with Model Air silver. There's loads of these Model Air colors that are very similar, like chrome. This one's silver, and there's not much in it. They're all very, very bright. A lot of the back of the chainmail is covered by the cloak, so I wanted some pretty dark shadows. I used Model Air Normal Black, and I used the Model Air because it's not as matte as Model Color. It's a tiny bit satin, and I think this is the right sort of happy medium for getting a matte shadow here. I dilute it a lot, so it's kind of just glazing the silver, darkening it down a little bit, rather than making it an opaque black. But you can see very quickly you can get a nice contrast between the light silvers and the slightly more matte shadows, and that's just easier for your eyes to kind of see the dark and the light when you're dealing with metallics. I think a contrast black, I think it's called Black Templar, would be fantastic too, as that's slightly more translucent, but diluting this a lot is going to do the same thing really. Got to mention I masked the cloak, which isn't essential, but I had a nice pre-highlight that I'd done in the beginning, and yeah, that just helped with things like the face. I don't want metallic on the face, and preserving the white that we sprayed in the first part is going to be helpful. I think masking is good if it doesn't take long, and these things were really easy and quick to mask. Just a little bit of blue tack and a couple bits of tape. If you're spending forever, then I would say masking's probably not worth the time. Now we have our beautiful white cloak that we can start building up some colour on. If you aren't sure where the highlight should go, then, spraying it black followed by white really helps a lot. But most companies that aren't Games Workshop produce miniatures that are 3D sculpted, and normally they put out some renders, or maybe even just the sculptor puts out the renders. Alejandro here has done some really cool renders for us to show off on the Kickstarter, and this can give you a really good guide where the highlights should go, provided that the light source in the render is the same as what you want to do for your project. Lucky for me, this angle here seems to be the same way that I've painted it, and if I look at the face of the render of the Dark Elf, then I can see that's exactly the same as how I've painted it, so this should work as a good reference. When you're more experienced, you don't need references like this because you're able to work it out and come up with light sources yourself, but if you're kind of afraid or not sure, then this can be really helpful in just getting over that and getting stuck in. I think highlight placement and the size and the shape is a really difficult thing to work out when you're newer to painting, but this is where maybe it's worth reaching out to friends that are better than you or anyone that can give you some advice, just trying out putting the highlights on and then maybe checking before you get it perfect, if you think you've got it in the right place. I want to do various shades of pale green, and I wanted the cloak to be an almost off-white, really pale green. So I tried out a new paint, which is light green blue from Vallejo, and I haven't tried out the new model color yet, which was my favorite paint range. So I'm really interested in testing out these new ones, and I hope they're as good or hopefully better than the previous iteration. You can see why I favored the white highlight, and if you don't have the airbrush, again I would recommend using a pale gray spray can. The two new ones from Citadel are excellent, the Wraithbone and the Grey Seer. I think they're really good primers, so I'd always choose a light primer like that over Chaos Black, unless it's a black armored miniature like the previous one we did. My first task though is to just get a really nice base coat on the highlight sections with this light green blue. I could paint the whole thing all over, but the black is going to serve as quite a nice guide, and I'll mix up a shadow colour and I'll paint those on. I think the key here is just to really take your time getting a nice beautiful base coat. I add a tiny bit of grey and start to block in some shadows. I've chosen grey because I don't want a vivid, rich looking green. I want a pale, off-whitey looking one. So the shadows, I don't want to add a stronger, more saturated green colour. I could add a darker green, but I don't think that's going to do what I want. I don't use black because that's a bit more difficult to control, but a dark or a medium grey, that's going to be, I think, the best thing for getting what I want in the shadows. I tried to start my brushstroke in the right spot, slightly over the first base coat, the pale one, and then pushing into the shadows. This is just going to give us a head start on the blending. It's not going to do it all, but it's worth pushing your brushstroke in the correct direction to save you a little bit of time later. You can see my paint's pretty translucent, so when it dries, it looks a lot darker than when I first apply it. And that means I'm going to have to build this up and make sure it's opaque so I can make any corrections and get the right amount of contrast, because there's definitely a thing as too much contrast. Not that the internet would make you believe that. I then start to blend by using a stippling method, and stippling is good because it just means I can be really accurate in the shape of the highlight and just gradually blend that together. You can use glazes and other things, but I think I want a little bit of texture in here, and stippling is just a good brush stroke to get a precise shape that you want. After I blended those together, I could work on increasing the highlights, and again I used the stippling method for this, and I wanted a really visible texture, so I did these quite big and chunky so you can see them from afar. I added an off-white. Ivory is good, but you could just use a normal white. Any kind of off-white is going to be fine for this. I like this method. I think it was the right one to do, but I quickly realized that this was going to take me far too long to stipple the entire thing, and I've set myself a certain amount of time to do this figure, as we're doing it for YouTube. And because I'd chosen white or an off-white, I think I just started a little bit dark, and it was going to take me ages to build up to that really, really light color. If you've got the time, then I definitely think this is the way to go, and the result will be amazing if you stipple the whole thing. But I realized that I was going to run out of time, and I had given myself a deadline for this figure. I then got some Tamiya flat white in the airbrush because I just needed to lighten up the really brightest parts. And while I was doing the airbrushing, I thought, I've made a mistake here. This isn't going to look quite right, etc. But in the end, actually, it did turn out okay. I think my first highlight should have had a little bit of white in, and that base coat was just a little bit too pale. I think when you look in the pot sometimes, I was looking at the light green blue. I thought, yeah, that's really pale. But actually, compared to white, it was pretty dark. So it just took me a long time to build up the pale highlights. And I think if I'd started a little bit paler, then I wouldn't have wasted some time doing this. Spraying a little bit of white on the highlights just managed to, get me there. And the thing is, when you airbrush the white, and I had it really, really thin, quite a lot of thinner in there, it's not going to be a very bright white anyway. And this meant I could stipple on the top of that with a pure white out of the pot, and I still got some contrast. And I thought I'd made a really big mistake, and it wasn't going to turn out okay, but actually it turned out great in the end. So no thanks to me. I managed to blag that, and I think it turned out great. I guess the takeaway is, if you want to do something off-white or close to white, then start your base coat much brighter than you think, and maybe just get some white, add a little bit of tone to it, and then darken down until you get it right. I think that's the mistake I made here, but I did manage to rescue it, and I really like how it turned out. Next, I want to tackle the face. Maybe I should have done this first, but it's fine. And what I want to do is get a really orangey color. I'm using this deep brown from AK. I'm going to use that as a wash and just run it over the pale white face that I've got here at the moment. And this is just to kind of run into the recesses and try and find the details of the face. Once that's dry, I use a slightly less diluted version, so it's a little bit more opaque, and now I'm a bit more purposeful. I can see where the recesses are because that first wash kind of showed me where I need to go, and I can just use that thicker paint and be a bit more direct with it. With all the dark parts finished, I can now work on getting a nice opaque skin in the highlight areas, and I just use some Kislev flesh here. And the first two steps kind of tell you where to go, so it's just a case of blocking in all the light parts with this color now. I build up some highlights by gradually adding some ivory. You could use some ice yellow, anything really, it's not too important. It's a very small part of the face that's showing, so it's more important to get the values and the placement right, as opposed to getting a specific tone. And I focus on one side of the face, really pushing the highlights here, as my light source is asymmetrical and it's coming in from this side. Once that's done, you can finish off the other details, like painting the eyes and the teeth and things like that. But it's quite nice, this figure, because you just have a small amount of skin to paint. And if you just put some really punchy highlights on the right bits of the face, then it's going to look great. I start to work on some other elements that will be small and fun. So I thought I'd do these gems, and I want to do another tone of green. This time I'm using Black Forest Green from Scale 75. It's another cold green, so it's going to work well with the cloak. And I just base coat the gems with this. While that was drying, I kind of work on the hair at the same time. And I used the same black forest green, but I mixed it in with the light green blue that we used for the cloak. And you can see this is a much richer, more saturated green to the dark grey shadows that we added on the cloak. And this is just going to kind of give a nice variation, some different greens throughout the project, but they're all that similar tone. I'm really multitasking here with some base coats, and I thought it'd be nice to have a really warm cream colour as opposed to the colder green things that we've got going on. So I used some warm grey here from AK, and against the green this looks super yellowish, which I really like. Now I need to finish some of these details off. I mixed in some ivory with the warm grey and just did some subtle highlights on the feathers. They don't need too much doing to them, a little bit of a feathered texture, but just focusing on picking out the shapes really. I tried to add fewer highlights to the ones at the bottom, so as it gets up and into the light, it's a little bit brighter. And this is a mix of the warm grey and the ivory, and I just use ivory on its own for the top sections only. Again, just to kind of draw the eye to the top. I go back to the mohawk and I add a little bit more of that forest green, and I'm using it pretty diluted so I can just gradually shade it, let it dry, and when I think I've got it dark enough, then I'll stop. What I'm doing is kind of making it richer at the top, but I'm also running it into the recesses, trying to pick out those individual hairs. I really like starting pale and gradually getting darker for a lot of things. And to get the colour and the amount of contrast right on this hair, I think this was, a really nice process. It wasn't particularly slow, and I got a really nice colour out of it, I think. I decided to do the inner part of the shoulder pads in black. I thought it would just look nice having a really dark colour against the gold. And I decided to do this with a slightly green grey. This I took some dark grey from AK, which is the same paint I used to highlight the black in the previous video. This time though, I added a tiny bit of that black forest green, and then I started to add in a lighter grey to that, just to control how green this black was. But just adding a little bit of tone I think works with the rest of the palette, and it fits with the theme. I really enjoyed how these shoulder pads are sculpted. They've got these nice chunky lines in, and you just need to pick where your light source is coming from and highlight all the facings that go towards that light source. So I really enjoyed this. It was pretty quick to do, but I think it had a big impact, and I just gradually added in that lighter grey until I felt, again, I had enough contrast. And I didn't want this part to be too distracting with a really shiny black, but I wanted it to have, some impact and it looked cool. I really like how this greenish black looks though, and it's something I'll keep in the back of my mind to use in the future because I really like how it turned out. And again, I go back to the hair and you can start to see how I work really. I think it's nice to kind of go around a few details, and I wouldn't call this speed painting, but it is nice to kind of be time efficient and multitask when it's possible. The gems were another part that were really easy. I just added some ivory into the forest green gradually, and I really wanted these to look like glass, so I knew I was going to go all the way to the top of ivory, and I just gradually added that in. But they're so small, even though I did quite a few steps adding in ivory and more ivory, this didn't take long at all. I really like how vibrant and strong this jade is, and I wouldn't want to use this for something like the cloak, which is a really large area, but for these small details like the gems, I think it was great. And again, I've not really used this colour before, and I'm using it on many parts of this figure, and some scale paints I don't like, but this is one that I'm really enjoying using, and it's been mixing well with other colours and really useful, and I just love how these gems turned out. So again, a paint that's going to maybe go into the favourite pile. The leather was the simplest thing, as I just base coated that with some Rhinox hide, and I highlighted with some US Field Drab from Vallejo. This is just like Steel Legion Drab. If you wanted to add more stages, you could do a mix of Rhinox and this and take it further, but I just focused on one nice highlight, a few scratches, and personally, I felt like that's enough, and I think this looks cool. I actually finished painting the figure with the metallics, which are the main element, and maybe that's not how everyone works, but I don't know. I don't know why I did this. It wasn't any reason in particular. I guess I just wanted to see how the gold looks with all the details finished, and then I could add the highlights accordingly. So I'm adding some light bronze here from Pro Acryl, which is such a favorite of mine for highlighting gold. It's kind of like a silver, but it's just got a little bit of tone in. And here I'm kind of just enhancing what the airbrush work did and trying to be as fine as possible. I'm doing the metallics fairly simply, so what I'm trying to do is just be neat, place them in the right part, be nice and sharp with the edge highlighting, and if I'm careful enough, I can get away with this simple process and very few steps. I push big highlights on the chest armor as that's really going to be in the light, and I also do some larger highlights on the helmet, all the focal areas really. Most parts I'm doing edge highlighting or just picking out any edges that are going to be facing the light, but on the upper areas around the helmet I do some larger ones just to keep that focus around the top. I wanted to try out some more contrast paints for shading metallics, so I used this purple, and yeah, I didn't dilute it, but I had a slightly wet brush and I was quite careful with how much I applied, but I think if you mixed it with the contrast medium, this would be a benefit. This purple was a little bit strong, and maybe I should have mixed it with some black so it wasn't sort of really powerful in color. Really, I'm just looking to get some definition between the scales here in the highlight parts. We've got a good general look from the airbrushing we did, so we just need a little more detail, definition around where we've just sprayed that chrome paint in the top. I built this up gradually in the silver, and I sort of, with more purpose rather than washing it all over, started to focus it just in some of the recesses. And this is partly because I haven't used contrast paints a lot, and I don't paint metallics that often, so for me this was kind of experimenting with what works and how to use these paints. But I really like the results, and actually painting this Duel I've really enjoyed the metallics, and yeah, it's definitely something I'll paint more of. I feel more confident in doing non-metallics because I feel I have more control using a matte paint, and the only reason I don't use metallics more often is I find I can get them clogged up if I do too many layers. But the way we've painted them today, we haven't done many layers of paint, just nice and simple, and that's why I like them for this project. I used the same purple on the gold, and I loved how this looked. There's quite a lot of green in this gold, so the kind of purpley red is a really nice contrast to that, and it's going to mean we don't need to do too many dark shadows or really bright highlights, as we're going to get a nice amount of contrast from the color. But where I did the highlights on one side of the stomach, I pushed the shadows with this purple on the other side. I found I didn't need to do too many layers with this contrast paint. The first kind of application is quite subtle, but it builds up really quickly if you're not too careful. So I think 2 steps of this was enough if you're not using any of that contrast medium. But yeah, I was really pleasantly surprised in how much I enjoyed doing this and the end result. I think the purple shading looks particularly good on the shoulder trims, where I just put a little bit in there. And you can see me adding it on the pec here. I think it looks really good. I quickly painted the inside, and you can't see it that well, so I didn't paint it perfectly. This time my top highlight was going to be that light green blue. I wasn't going to add any white in it, and that meant I could add a little bit more dark grey into the shadow areas, and this just made it easier, to be honest. I think the darker colours you're painting, in general, it's going to be easier, as you don't have to do as many steps or deal with things like the opacity of white. I did the same method though, using stippling, and it's great. You can see I blocked in the areas in the previous clip, and then I can just kind of blend it together with some fast stippling, and I really do rate this method of kind of blocking in the sections, and then if you just stipple them together, I think you can get pretty great results in a reasonable amount of time. Now let's move on to the base, and I'm going to give a big shout out to Taro Model Maker, who just does the best resin plinths you can buy. So if you want a plinth for your display minis, your gaming minis, I just don't think there's anywhere else to go. Even if you're in the US or another country, maybe the postage is going to cost you a bit more, but it's just worth it for the amazing quality, the crisp black. Yeah, I've just got to shout him out. They're amazing. I went for the 90mm round. The Duel fitted on the 90mm square, but I thought I'd rather build it out and do a bigger base, and I think round looks cooler. I'm sure you've already heard of him and seen his products, but I just wanted to shout him out as, I love these plinths to work on. I raised the base that you get just by putting a couple gaming bases actually underneath just to get a little bit of height. And what I'm going to do now is kind of blend it into the plinth with some milliput. So milliput's amazing to work with if you haven't tried it before, and I do think it's probably the best one for things like rock. And it's very forgiving, so if you're afraid of trying something like this, just don't, because any mistake you make or something you don't like, you can always cut it away and have another go. So here in the beginning, I'm just going to get really, really rough shapes and try and taper it down to the ground so I have a bit of a gradient. And I think one of the best ways to use milliput is as it gradually dries, you can improve your shapes of your sculpting. It's very soft and moves easily, as you can see when you mix it fresh, so it's best just to get kind of rough shapes, get an idea, but you can refine the sculpting as it kind of dries. And I tend to work on something else and just check on how the milliput's doing, resculpt it every hour or something like that. Eventually it gets a little bit crumbly and you have to stop playing with it, but you can do a pretty good job. I add some sand, some pretty rough big stuff, as it's quite a big base around any of the parts that don't have the milliput, and I leave that and come back to it the next day. One of the best things about milliput is when it dries, it's absolutely rock solid, and you can take a knife, some sandpaper to cut and get some sharper shapes into it. So if you couldn't sculpt it quite right, you can carve into it and maybe get a better result this way. And also, if you still don't like it after you've cut away with a knife or changed it, you can just try again. So this is why if you're worried about trying something like this out, just dive into it. Maybe it's not perfect your first time, but just keep practicing. And by cutting things away and having a second or third attempt, which is normally what I have to do because I'm not a great sculptor, eventually I get something I'm happy with. The last step, I just masked the sides. I did this earlier actually. I then primed it with some black, followed by some wraithbone. And after I'd primed my rocks, I was surprised how good they looked. I didn't think I'd done an amazing job when I sculpted with the milliput. I was pleasantly surprised. So maybe it's the same for you. So if you're not too sure how good your sculpting is, maybe try getting some primer on and it's going to look better. So with the painting, I wanted this pale base coat, and I've used the wraithbone can just because it's really quick. And also, I actually tried to get a little bit of speckling from the can, and that's fine for texture on the rock. Here, I'm just going in with some storm vermin fur, and I like this a lot for rock because it's got a little bit of brown in, and I tried to stay away from cold greys for a start, but neutral greys for rock. I used to always paint with neutral and cold greys, and it just didn't look natural. I think any grey that has some warmth, some brown in, that's going to really help looking more natural. And I think when you paint this diluted paint over the white here, you can really see the brown come out of it, whereas in the pot, it does look pretty grey. While the paint is still wet, I put some diluted little dabs of green ochre from AK, just randomly. I like to put wet colours on wet paint to try and let them interact and mingle together, and I think it can look really messy during the process, but when it's dried you get a nice natural looking rock. I really find rock difficult to paint, so when I'm walking out and about I always look at rocks and think how can I make them look more natural, and it kind of surprises me how many patches of yellow and browns are in there. So this is something I'm trying to incorporate more, and this is a perfect time to kind of experiment with that, which is why I use this green ochre. I also use some burnt umber for the ground, and where it touches the rock I just had a little bit of that brown mixed with that again, so it kind of interacts and isn't too abrupt. It just wants to kind of softly blend into the ground, I think. I built some confidence with the green ochre. I think I was a little hesitant, as I was testing it out. So I ended up putting some heavier washes over the top. And as my confidence grew, I just kind of went in on this technique a bit more, added some little bits of Mornfang brown, went heavier on the green ochre. And yeah, these are very diluted. And if I didn't like a part, I just got my wet brush and kind of let it wash away. And yeah, I'm working really quick here. This isn't actually sped up, but this is totally forgiving on rocks. And with a little bit of experience, I think you can pull off painting in this kind of slapdash messy way. But for me, it just helps it look more natural rather than trying to be controlled. If I paint really controlled, then I tend to get this really even, unnatural looking mix of colors. So yeah, just kind of splooshing it around is really enjoyable. And I think painting is supposed to be fun, I've heard. So yeah, it's kind of fun doing it this way. While it was still wet, I also experimented doing some really tiny dots of green ochre. And this could be like lichen. Because it's wet, it slightly diffuses the dots. And I think this looks really natural, and I didn't go too hard on this. It was genuinely an experiment to see if in the future I could use this to do a lichen effect, and I think it definitely works. I've done it before just using diluted paint, but I think the wet surface helps make it look more diffused, and yeah, just blends into everything else nicely. So yeah, I really enjoyed getting to experiment with this rock, and it sounds so silly to find rock painting difficult, but it's about getting the tones and the feeling right, that it's natural looking and not just some grey thing with edge highlights, basically. It looks a bit of a mess in those previous clips, but you can see here where it's almost dry that I really like the colour and the variation with the little bits of yellow. Although maybe not refined enough for a competition piece or something, I still think it looks nice. And what I'm doing here is trying to stipple to get some precise highlights and things like that. I basically deemed it unnecessary. I think it looks really natural as it is. And yeah, just painting the rock with washes, it works. I think, I haven't really done any precise painting or sharp highlights. I don't think it needs it. So I decided that this was going to be a waste of time. Where I'd diluted so much paint, some of the paint had split, which is fine, by the way. Where it splits, you get some nice color variation. But I had a real difference in finishes, a little bit glossy, a little bit matte. So I did decide to ultra matte the whole thing, and this really helps. In the past, I've had some ultra matte things turn glossy eventually, but I think this was my old batch of varnish, and I've got a new one now, and it seems to be fine. But just a slight word of caution, and maybe you've experienced this. If you have, then leave a comment. But yeah, I've just got stuff from 2 years ago that's turned shiny now, but this new pot of varnish seems to be fine. So maybe I just had a dodgy one. I thought the ground would benefit from some natural umber pigment here, and this color is going to work really well with the green ochre. I just did this on the ground. My autofocus really let me down there. But yeah, I think that this just makes it look dusty and matte, and the ground was looking too black from the burnt umber. But yeah, this really helped, and I think that the tone just worked so well against the green ochre patches. Okay, so test fit now. You can see I've got a little bit of foam, a nice little bed for my minis as they wait for the base. Yeah, and I just checked they fitted, obviously, before committing. But I'm really happy with how the base turned out, actually. I loved experimenting with the rock. Again, just to reiterate, it's something I struggle with, and I'm definitely going to use these colors again, especially the green ochre. That was awesome. I hadn't actually used that paint at all before, so good to find a use for it. I glued the minis in and just added a little bit of powder around the feet just to tie them together, so it's not just perfect gold with the rest of it. And my favourite part is peeling the masking tape off to reveal that perfect black side of the plinth. And this always just makes things look better. It's always messy on the side of the tape where I've sprayed and got powders. And just having that clean black line against the, how we've painted the rock and the groundwork is always fantastic. And here we go. One finished Duel. And I hope you like the look of this project. As I said in the first video, the aim of this was really to paint display figures in a simple way or an approachable way without trying to be patronizing. It's just a real passion of Henry and me to make people have a go at painting these larger scale figures. You know, they're not actually that scary. You can use simple techniques, just take your time and try and do a good job. And they don't have to take forever either. This Duel didn't take me ages. I could have done it a little more refined, but it was nice to do something just in a fun way of painting. When I painted the box art for Stear on the horse, I did that all non-metallics, which is something I really enjoy, but there's no getting away from it. It's very time consuming. And I love how the metallics look, and they were very, very quick in comparison to those non-metallics. So yeah, pick and choose the techniques you want. As well as that, we did one without an airbrush and it looks great. And we did one with loads of airbrushing and I think they match. I don't think you can tell that one's been airbrushed loads and one hasn't at all. I think, it's just two different ways of getting to the same place, really. I think I've chatted enough. This has been quite a long video. We had quite a few steps to get through and the basing as well. But yeah, I'll just give one last shout out to the Kickstarter. If you fancy trying out this Duel, I'm going to say it, but I think they're great models, and hopefully I've shown that. That's the aim of these videos, really, to show you that painting, a display figure doesn't have to be that scary, but also hopefully to, give you some guidance on how to paint these particular figures. And I think they've been really, really fun. Let me know your thoughts below, and if you've picked up any minis from the Kickstarter. I'm going to be painting this bust next, and I'm going to be painting this probably as good as I can, which is going to be not what I've done so far on the range. There's always those time constraints trying to get things ready for the Kickstarter, but I'm really going to take my time on the next bust, and that's going to be over on Patreon, so I'm super excited to do that and eventually do the rest of the range as well. Yep, if you like what we've done, then please check out the Kickstarter and all of that stuff. You know what to do. And I will see you in the next video.